At first glance, the genealogy that stretches from Adam to Noah in the early chapters of Genesis might seem like a dry list of ancient names, 10 generations bridging the Garden of Eden and the Great Flood. But looked at more closely, this sequence is something else entirely. Beneath its surface lies a structured story, a pattern of progression and decline that speaks not only to the ancient world, but to the universal dynamics of how cultures rise, evolve, and fall. This study begins with a simple but powerful insight. The biblical authors were not merely telling stories, they were encoding systems of understanding. The names in this lineage, when read in Hebrew and situated in their narrative contexts, form a symbolic sequence. Each name is more than a label. It is a concept, a transformation, a stage in a larger unfolding. The figures from Adam to Noah don't just mark the passage of time, they map a process of development, breakdown, and survival. What makes this genealogy unique is that it aligns across multiple dimensions. Textually, the meanings and letter structures of the Hebrew names reflect evolving patterns of identity, memory, loss, and renewal. Narratively, the events that surround each figure in Genesis, from the fall of Adam to the ascension of Enoch to the flood in Noah's day, track with increasing precision the stages of moral, spiritual, and cultural complexity. And when we step back to interpret the whole, what emerges is not a mere story of ancestry, but a model of terminal evolution, a civilizational arc that culminates not in triumph, but in collapse and the desperate preservation of what little can be saved. The central claim of this project is simple, but far-reaching. Genesis 1 through 9 is more than myth or theology. It is a diagnosis of cultural systems pushed to their limits, and a coded proposal for how symbolic life might endure beyond its own saturation point. From the undivided perfection of God, through the recursive awareness of Adam, into the fragile continuity of Seth and the abstract invocation of Enosh, the story traces a steep climb into symbolic richness. It peaks in the convergence of Enoch, who walked with God, a figure of full moral integration, and then stalls. What follows is stasis, mimicry, and collapse. Noah does not represent progress. He represents a container, an ark not just of animals but of meaning, salvaging what remains. Is this a hidden history encoded by the authors, or simply universal patterns that transcend time and space? That question I will leave to you. For what we find in these ancient pages is not just an origin story, but a profound reflection on the limits of consciousness, culture, and symbolic inheritance. This genealogy thinks. It observes its own ascent and recognizes the inevitability of its fall. And in doing so, it leaves behind a message, not how to perfect the world, but how to carry coherence through catastrophe. In the beginning, as Genesis portrays, is not merely God, but a remarkable vision of a perfect pattern, an undifferentiated potentiality, Elohim. At first glance, this divine name may simply identify a creator, yet deeper reading reveals a structured logic hidden within. Elohim is described in Hebrew using letters that speak of divine singularity, creative instruction, generative breath, and fertile potential. It represents not a personality so much as a fundamental coherence, an ideal form of relational harmony that exists before matter, before biology, and before culture itself. In modern terms, we might think of it as pure information, something like the Platonic logos or a quantum field, perfectly balanced yet not yet manifested into reality. Yet this ideal state, while beautiful, is inherently incomplete in one critical sense. It has no counterpart, no embodied reflection, no manifestation in space or time. Such coherence is stable but static, perfect but unable to grow. The tension of this perfection is that it demands expression. Something must emerge to reflect it, to instantiate its logic in tangible reality. Thus, creation begins as the outward projection of divine coherence into material form. It moves from potentiality to actuality, not through need, but through the very logic of its perfection. Coherence must be mirrored, relationality must be lived. Into this relational imperative steps Adam, the first symbolic human. Adam embodies the remarkable transformation from abstract pattern into concrete experience. Biologically, he marks the point where human cognition first crosses into symbolic recursion, where brains become capable of thinking about thinking, naming things, understanding identity, and organizing reality through categories and relationships. Culturally, Adam initiates the dawn of proto-culture, engaging in tasks of naming, agriculture, tool use, and ritual. Spiritually and logically, Adam is the first recursive agent, consciously reflecting divine patterns, given the mandate to govern, steward, and mirror creation. His life is structured as a feedback loop: divine image, breath, moral vocation, each reinforcing the others in a cycle of identity and purpose. However, the very strength of Adam's recursion contains its own vulnerability. As consciousness reflects back upon itself, errors and distortions begin to creep into the loop. Autonomy, though essential to genuine self-awareness and moral action, introduces the possibility of self-negation and contradiction. Recursive thinking can propagate mistakes. Moral choices can become corrupted by misunderstanding, bias, and violence. The divine pattern, mirrored within human agency, thus risks distortion precisely because it is now self-contained. The more powerful the recursive mind becomes, the greater the chance it could collapse under its own internal contradictions. This fragile coherence is rescued temporarily by Seth, the figure who symbolizes intentional continuity after catastrophic rupture. Seth introduces the concept of structured inheritance, of lineage not simply as biological descent, but as symbolic transmission. He embodies humanity's leap into causal understanding, the idea that identity and memory must be carefully transmitted to survive, that culture itself is something to be consciously passed down, rather than simply assumed. Biologically, Seth reflects a stabilizing kinship system, brains evolving a deeper capacity to encode, remember, and communicate complex symbolic information across generations. Culturally, Seth embodies the birth of genealogy itself, lineages, initiation rites, myths of origin, all now consciously crafted to transmit moral and cultural identity through time. Yet even Seth's great innovation, careful, purposeful inheritance, reveals its own hidden flaw. Once cultural continuity becomes dependent on precise transmission, it risks becoming rigid, inflexible, and fragile. Perfect transmission is nearly impossible to sustain over time. Small distortions inevitably accumulate. Genealogies become myths, myths become dogmas, and dogmas become rigid traditions resistant to necessary adaptation and change. Thus, what began as purposeful inheritance can harden into unyielding tribalism, fixed narratives, and brittle cultural identities vulnerable to disruption. It is precisely the tension created by Seth's fragile continuity that gives rise to Enosh, the next transformative leap. Enosh represents a dramatic turn inward. Human beings become acutely aware of mortality, vulnerability, and finitude. Rather than destroying symbolic coherence, this awareness transforms it. Suddenly, humanity can abstract from physical experience. People begin to invoke higher powers, recognizing mortality as both biological inevitability and cultural catalyst. This period marks the true birth of spirituality, not as abstract theology, but as the desperate and hopeful response to existential anxiety. Culture, now faced with the undeniable fact of death, responds with rituals, taboos, ceremonies, and stories. Mortality's shadow, ironically, deepens cultural and symbolic complexity, introducing a new level of existential depth into human consciousness. Yet even this profound turn toward existential awareness contains within it a dangerous pressure. The invocation of spiritual power initially arises from genuine awe and need, but can rapidly devolve into superstition, fear-driven rituals, and oppressive social systems. Culture now begins to encode dread alongside meaning, and power alongside vulnerability. Religious rituals risk becoming coercive, not liberating, tools of power rather than pathways of transcendence. The existential depth first opened by Enosh must somehow transcend its own fearfulness, lest it trap humanity in perpetual anxiety and spiritual stagnation. With the existential awakening of Enosh, human cultures entered a profoundly deeper and more inward-looking phase, marked by an awareness of mortality and an emerging spirituality. Yet this newfound depth brought fresh challenges, as the consciousness of human frailty threatened to trap societies in cycles of fear and anxiety. From this tension emerges Kenan, the next major transformation in the evolutionary drama laid out in the Genesis lineage. Kenan signifies a critical shift, the intentional inclusion of grief, loss, and trauma into cultural identity itself. This is not mere reaction, it is integration. Instead of attempting to reject or deny suffering, human societies begin to encode it deliberately into ritual, myth, and memory, transforming pain into structural continuity. Biologically, this stage corresponds to a striking evolutionary adaptation, the capacity for epigenetic inheritance of stress responses, trauma, and coping mechanisms. Humans evolve brains increasingly capable of transmitting not just learned skills or abstract knowledge, but emotional states, fears, and stresses across generations. Culturally, Kenan's moment manifests as oral traditions that center on lamentation, exile, and collective remembrance. Narratives become saturated with themes of loss, fallenness, and longing. Spiritually, these rituals take on powerful emotional resonance, turning sorrow itself into a sacred act, a shared acknowledgement that suffering is fundamental to human existence. Grief, rather than being destructive, becomes formative, binding communities tightly together in shared histories of struggle and resilience. Yet inclusive grief, for all its adaptive and integrative power, carries its own hidden crisis. By institutionalizing trauma, communities risk enshrining pain without transcending it. The cultural imagination can become fixated, endlessly rehearsing loss, unable to progress beyond cycles of mourning. Trauma, now sacred, can stagnate rather than inspire. Painful memories begin to define societies rather than inform them, creating rigid identities steeped in victimhood and self-pity. The biological inheritance of stress and fear responses, initially adaptive, may amplify anxiety rather than resolve it, locking generations into inherited psychological burdens. It is this internal tension, the challenge of transcending entrenched grief, that propels the next profound shift, embodied in the figure of Mahalalel. With Mahalalel, societies pivot upward and outward, transforming collective trauma into acts of praise, worship, and transcendent aspiration. Here emerges a structured spiritual ecosystem: temples, liturgies, hymns, and festivals. Culturally, grief is no longer the final word. It is transfigured into rituals of gratitude, devotion, and awe. Praise becomes the regulating axis of human community, capable of channeling emotional intensity into constructive social coherence and collective purpose. Biologically, humans begin to master ecstatic states. Chanting, rhythmic dance, and collective ritual induce neurological states of intense shared experience. Communities experience flow states, neural synchrony, and emotional bonding at unprecedented levels. These biological mechanisms reinforce social cohesion, reduce internal conflict, and foster group resilience. Logically and spiritually, praise becomes an explicit expression of the triadic pattern itself, aligning humanity with divine coherence through structured worship. Liturgy and ritual now explicitly mirror the ideal order that originated with Elohim, transforming grief-filled chaos into spiritual order. Yet even this adaptive and powerful convergence of biology, culture, and spirituality is not immune to crisis. Structured praise and ecstatic worship, once liberated from grief, can become ends in themselves, detached from ethical reflection or adaptive utility. Liturgies may ossify into empty repetitions. Temples may become centers of power rather than transcendence. Rituals once charged with genuine emotional and spiritual resonance can now mask underlying moral decay or social injustice. In such conditions, the spiritual system no longer responds effectively to evolving human needs, but instead preserves existing structures of power and hierarchy. From this contradiction emerges the figure of Jared, whose time represents a pivotal threshold. The harmonic convergence of the human and the divine spiritual aspiration and earthly reality reaches a critical and dangerous resonance. Jared's generation symbolizes a cultural state in which mythic imagination and biological experience interpenetrate deeply. Stories of giants, demigods, god-kings, and hybrids emerge, revealing a symbolic system on the verge of saturation. Spiritually, the boundaries between sacred and profane blur. Divine archetypes become confused with political power, and myth overwhelms rational discernment. Biologically, Jared's moment represents a heightened exploration of altered states, hallucinogenic rituals, ecstatic shamanism, and charismatic figures who embody both religious and political authority. These states reinforce strong in-group cohesion, but risk generating dangerous instability when no longer carefully regulated. Culturally, societies struggle to maintain coherent moral frameworks under intense symbolic saturation. Complexity, rather than liberating, begins to overwhelm cognitive and ethical capacities. Mythic narratives multiply uncontrollably, becoming internally inconsistent and morally ambiguous, confusing rather than clarifying human purpose. The crisis of Jared's generation thus marks a crucial turning point in the Genesis lineage's evolutionary arc. Harmonious resonance has become over-integration. Symbolic saturation threatens systemic collapse. The boundary between humanity and its own symbolic imagination has grown dangerously thin, resulting in societies increasingly unable to differentiate between representation and reality. In this critical resonance, the pressure builds toward a higher integration, one capable of stabilizing the chaotic convergence of biological, cultural, and spiritual complexity. Thus, this arc, from Kenan's inclusive grief, through Mahalalel's ecstatic transcendence, to Jared's critical harmonic instability, charts the evolutionary emergence, flourishing, and ultimate crisis of deeply resonant symbolic cultures. These ancient authors understood with remarkable subtlety that each step forward carried inherent vulnerabilities. Inclusive memory could become stagnation, structured worship could degenerate into hollow ritual, and harmonic resonance could destabilize entire social orders. With Jared's generation, the evolutionary drama outlined in Genesis reached a point of critical harmonic instability, a perilous juncture where symbolic complexity threatened to overwhelm the coherence of the system entirely. Into this turbulent context stepped Enoch, a figure whose Hebrew name, Chanok, Hanvok, from the root Aten-kh meaning to initiate or to dedicate, reveals much about the radical solution attempted by this generation. Facing cognitive overload, confronted by symbolic forms too rich to sustain effectively, this generation turned toward a novel and ambitious response, not cultural simplification or symbolic retreat, but biological intensification. Their solution was to engineer themselves cognitively, biologically enhancing their minds and mental capacities, and so becoming capable of holding increasingly complex symbolic structures within their own consciousness. Cognitively, this decision appeared to succeed profoundly. The generation of Enoch achieved unprecedented depths of symbolic recursion and abstraction, becoming able not only to sustain but to internally integrate the sophisticated symbolic systems that had previously risked collapsing under their own complexity. Their enhanced minds could contemplate, understand, and consciously mirror the divine order. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Far from being an enigmatic disappearance, this triadic phrase encodes the full arc of Enoch's generation: complete internal coherence, cultural non-replication, and biological removal from the generational stream. For the first time, symbolic cognition ceased to be enigmatic or ambiguous. It became entirely lucid, entirely self-contained. But that very containment proved isolating. What they embodied could not be transferred, only concluded. Yet culturally, this cognitive triumph contained a subtle but profound negation. Unable to invent corresponding innovations in knowledge transmission, the civilization was trapped by older methods: pyramids, megaliths, resonant temples, geometric inscriptions that were awe-inspiring yet fundamentally opaque, incapable of efficiently encoding or transmitting this increasingly abstract and recursive understanding. No matter how sophisticated their minds became, they still had no effective cultural infrastructure to translate internal coherence into external communication. The knowledge they carried remained fundamentally private, understood clearly within individual minds, yet scarcely communicable even to contemporaries. They were wise beyond measure, but silent in their wisdom, their insights beautiful yet ineffable, leaving nothing more enduring than cryptic monuments, whose original purposes became increasingly enigmatic. Biologically, Enoch's generation was still viable within natural parameters, fertile, stable, capable. But this very viability rested upon a razor's edge. They had pushed natural human cognitive capacities near their upper limit, depending on increasingly narrow selective criteria to sustain this heightened intellect. The maintenance of such refined cognition demanded conditions that, while not yet interfering dramatically with reproduction, already began subtly to pressure natural human biological limits. This biological arrangement could still hold steady for the duration of their generation, but not beyond. It represented peak biological optimization without true alteration, a final stage of unmodified human potential. Thus, Enoch's generation, while successful and even exemplary in its moment, set the stage for an inevitable systemic shift. Having failed to develop the cultural means to externalize and propagate their symbolic coherence, the cognitive enhancements that made them internally successful also rendered their knowledge private, non-transferable, and ultimately non-renewable. The result was an unforeseen structural tension, a civilization of brilliant, self-contained minds whose insights could not be shared, documented, or taught. Enoch's extraordinary cognitive achievement, paradoxically, led directly into a logic of preservation and containment rather than ongoing cultural evolution. The lesson is profound. Integration at such an extreme cerebral intensity becomes a form of evolutionary fragility, susceptible to sudden disappearance, precisely because it cannot adequately replicate and stabilize within larger communal contexts. It was precisely this underlying negation, this inability to transfer or scale their achieved coherence, that drove the subsequent Methuselah stage. Methuselah represents the profound biological response of a civilization trapped in cognitive and cultural stasis. His Hebrew name, Methuselah, constructed from Mem, Tav, Shin, Lamed, and Chet, suggests profound meanings, originating chaos, covenantal boundary, fiery transformation, ordered instruction, and a limitation or boundary condition. Methuselah symbolizes not advancement, but delay, the indefinite prolongation of a saturated cultural state. His longevity, rather than being a mark of evolutionary success, paradoxically underscores stagnation and perfectly captures the essential dynamic of his generation. Not advancing symbolic complexity or innovation, but instead indefinitely prolonging existing cognitive states. Cognition at this stage became archival, shifting focus from symbolic evolution toward preservation of what had already been achieved. The primary cultural preoccupation was no longer learning or innovation, but sheer maintenance, simply holding the symbolic knowledge they possessed for as long as possible, though still unable to meaningfully transmit it. Biologically, Methuselah's solution took form as radical life extension, symbolically recorded in his legendary lifespan of 969 years. While this number itself is symbolic rather than literal, it starkly encodes the underlying condition, a culture that sought continuity not through fertility or renewal but through sheer longevity. Extended lifespans became necessary precisely because the system lacked any viable means of cultural propagation. With the cognitive breakthroughs of Enoch trapped in individual minds, longevity became the only remaining option to preserve symbolic coherence. However, the unintended consequences soon became evident. Biological adaptations toward prolonged life steadily eroded reproductive viability, introducing infertility and demographic stagnation, inevitably leading toward an evolutionary bottleneck. The generation of Methuselah thus found itself suspended in a prolonged yet precarious stasis, its members increasingly isolated, cognitively inert, culturally repetitive, and biologically infertile. Their society had trapped itself in a closed system, unable either to regress or progress, only capable of indefinite preservation of an untransmittable symbolic legacy. The attempt to circumvent the problem through life extension failed to address its root cause, the fundamental inability of culture to externalize and share the symbolic coherence that cognition had achieved. Methuselah's prolonged existence represents neither cultural nor biological success, but rather a profound evolutionary delay, a drawn-out pause before inevitable systemic collapse. What this ancient narrative encodes remarkably presciently is a cautionary tale directly relevant to modern society. Over-reliance on intellectual elaboration and symbolic complexity, divorced from embodied experience, practical wisdom, and adaptive flexibility, ultimately leads not to progress but to evolutionary paralysis. Civilizations built exclusively upon cerebral refinement may achieve momentary peaks of integration, but without grounding that integration in adaptive practice and communal resilience, they inevitably stall out, their cultural frameworks increasingly unable to handle novel challenges. By the time the genealogy reaches the figure of Lamech, the symbolic coherence of Enoch and even the prolonged stasis of Methuselah had given way entirely. What emerged was inversion. Lamech becomes a dark mirror of the symbolic tradition he inherits. He speaks in deliberate triadic poetry, yet his verses celebrate vengeance rather than justice, power rather than wisdom. The cultural structures that once embodied coherence now resonate only as hollow rituals. The form remains, but substance has drained away. His name itself, Lamech, reflects this descent into inversion. Constructed from Hebrew letters Lamed, Mem, and final Kaf, it suggests the imposition of authority, the encroachment of chaos, and the rigid enforcement of power. Authority reduced to force, order dissolving into disorder. Culturally, Lamech's generation still mimicked the outward symbols of integration, yet no longer possessed the underlying coherence that once gave those symbols meaning. Ritual, memory, and tradition continued outwardly, but their internal logic had vanished, replaced by hollow repetition and rigid conformity. Cognitively, symbolic coherence became inaccessible, trapped in overly refined and individualized minds inherited from Enoch and prolonged through Methuselah. There was no cultural means remaining to transmit their understanding outwardly. The generation could continue the symbolic system in ritual form, but its deeper meanings remained inaccessible, even to the initiates themselves. The symbolic order existed only superficially. Biologically, the civilization had now entered a profound bottleneck. The previous stage's solution, radical longevity and biological preservation, failed to produce renewal. Lifespan extension succeeded in prolonging individual lives, but inadvertently suppressed the capacity for generational renewal, adaptability, and reproduction. Human lines, increasingly cognitively specialized and socially stratified, faced demographic stagnation. Biological resilience diminished, and genetic diversity collapsed. The evolutionary system stalled, unable to regenerate itself. Innovation ceased, entropy took hold. In such a critical moment, the last remaining viable strategy was association, a necessary if desperate reintegration with those outside the symbolic lineage. Tribes and populations who had not participated fully in the escalating cognitive specialization, lineages previously disregarded or isolated, now became essential precisely because they preserved more flexible biological traits, greater genetic diversity, and cultural simplicity. These external groups might have lacked the symbolic sophistication, cognitive recursion, or ritual complexity previously prized, but they retained crucial adaptive capacities: fertility, flexibility, and cultural openness. For Lamech's generation, association was no longer taboo-breaking decadence, it was urgent necessity. Boundaries dissolved, not out of choice, but through the sheer pressure of survival. It is into this existential juncture that Noah emerges, not as a symbolic apex, but as the figure of minimal, viable continuity. The Hebrew name Noah, built from the letters Nun, representing the seed or continuity, and Chet, representing boundary or containment, perfectly expresses this function. He is not perfection, but a seed preserved, not expansive growth, but careful containment. Noah embodies survival rather than culmination. His generation synthesizes the best available elements, just enough symbolic structure to preserve coherence, just enough biological adaptability to allow renewal. Unlike the preceding generations, Noah does not extend symbolic complexity further. Instead, he simplifies, condenses, and preserves it, stabilizing it within a viable cultural and biological form. In this context, the flood represents not merely a punishment or tragedy, but a systemic reset. It symbolizes the clearing of evolutionary dead ends, tribes and lineages trapped in inert complexity, minds isolated by internal coherence without external expression, and traditions preserved without meaning or adaptability. It is an extinction event marking the disappearance of those unable or unwilling to reintegrate with simpler, more flexible cultural and biological forms. Noah's Ark becomes a potent metaphor, a cultural and genetic repository, the minimum necessary structure carrying forward symbolic coherence. This ark preserves only what is viable, resilient, and transmissible. Thus, Noah signifies not the height of symbolic achievement, but a fresh beginning, a reboot. He carries forward a symbolic genome, stripped down to essentials, combining surviving strands of coherence with renewed biological vitality and flexibility. The narrative makes this explicit. Noah does not ascend to symbolic complexity. He shelters and preserves, carrying knowledge forward rather than upward. His simplicity, humility, and practicality represent the adaptation required to continue the symbolic project sustainably. What Genesis offers in its genealogical structure is neither theology nor myth in the conventional sense, but a form of symbolic intelligence, a recursive system for thinking about limits, saturation, collapse, and viable continuity. It does not describe a fall from perfection, nor a rise toward enlightenment. It encodes something far more exacting, the conditions under which coherence is possible at all. This is not a history of people, but of pattern under pressure, an evolutionary trace of a system learning, failing, and adapting in real time. From the earliest recursive minds to cultures saturated with ritual, from abstracted grief to unsustainable brilliance, the story documents not moral failures but structural contradictions. Symbolic recursion gives rise to meaning. Meaning gives rise to system. System collapses when its own complexity outpaces its mechanisms of renewal. This is not a parable. It is a diagram. What endures in Noah is not wisdom or transcendence or insight. It is transmissibility. What survives is what can be carried. The ark is not a religious symbol. It is a functional metaphor for cognitive resilience, the reduction of symbolic excess into something that can cross the flood of failure and reseed coherence in a changed world. Seen in this light, Genesis is not a story about divine intervention. It is a cultural technology, a memory structure built to preserve pattern through collapse. It encodes not a warning, but a principle, that every intelligence which refines itself to the point of saturation must also develop the logic of compression, or die beneath the weight of its own recursion. This is not just about early humans or mythic time, it is about now. Every system, biological, cultural, symbolic, will reach its limit. Every lineage will face its Methuselah moment, where extension substitutes for innovation and coherence begins to degrade into performance. When that moment comes, survival will not belong to the most advanced, the most powerful, or the most refined. It will belong to those who remember how to reduce, reconnect, and begin again. Genesis doesn't just tell us how the world began, it shows us what must be remembered when it ends. And so, Genesis encodes a memory not of perfection but of thresholds. The flood is not a punishment, it is a systemic reset. It marks the end of symbolic saturation and the beginning of symbolic viability. What endures is not the most complex form, but the form that can be carried, sheltered, and reborn. This is the logic of survival. Symbolic systems, like biological organisms, obey constraints. They must remain transmissible, they must adapt to failure, and they must be willing to distill, not accumulate. The genealogy that thinks teaches us that coherence must evolve, not through endless ascent, but through pruning, reintegration, and return. What survives is not what climbs the highest, but what learns how to begin again.